Welcome to the Standing in This Place podcast. I'm Rachel Carter and I'm the artist behind this project, supported by National Lottery project grants through Arts Council England. I'm going to be telling the historic tale of the intertwining of the lives of women working in the textile mills of the industrial Midlands and the enslaved women working the cotton fields in America. We're going to welcome back to the podcast Adrian Farmer, Heritage Coordinator at the Derwent Valley Mills Wood Heritage Site, or in short, the Keeper of the Heritage and History, for another chat about the cotton mills of the Derwent Valley. So welcome back to the podcast, Adrian.
Hi, glad to be back.
Thank you. So back in episode 2, we discovered who was Arkwright and Strutt and Evans and the new methods of industrialisation that swept across the Midlands and really changed the face of the industrial areas that we know across the Derwent Valley and across into Nottinghamshire. And we looked in depth at the mill owners, and in subsequent episodes we've heard from Dr. Susan Seymour of the University of Nottingham, and we discussed where did that cotton come from before it came to the Midlands. So now we know that that cotton was picked in terrible circumstances, often by enslaved women and children and men that were taken from their homelands and was forced to work in those cotton fields. And then it entered the ports of places like Liverpool and Bristol and made its way down into the Derwent Valley to be spun. So let's dive into who was doing the spinning. Let's talk about the mill workers.
Brilliant.
So you did point out a few things to me before about the growth of the Derwent Valley. So what was the early incentives for people to come and move from sort of field and sort of rural areas to come and move into these new towns and go and work in these mills?
Well, initially, I mean, the difference was huge in terms of if you think in terms of Derbyshire in particular, but this sort of area, the Peak District, very hard to make a living of any kind in those sort of, it was poor soil, it was hard to work the fields. People were living in hovels because they were basically just making their homes as best they could. And then this opportunity arises where there are proper homes, well-built stone houses in a community where good money could be earned. It was seen as good money, certainly to agricultural workers at the time. Very structured life, a very different life to what they'd lived, but actually a type of life where they knew that they had somewhere to sleep, that there were meals, regular meals on the table, and that was a big step away from the lives that they'd been living. So although looking back then, the mill workers' jobs probably don't seem that appealing, but looking from the other direction, from what there had been in the past, certainly in rural Derbyshire and this area, it was very much a step up, a better life for them.
So do we know who was building these homes? Were they going to sort of building companies and saying build these, or was it the mill owners themselves who were building the houses?
Initially, it looks like it was the mill owners themselves, but quite quickly, it's like every market, isn't it? People suddenly see that there's an opportunity there. So others, speculators, were coming in and building houses and then selling them on to the mill owners, because the mill owners, you open a mill, suddenly you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of people that you need to encourage to come and live by that mill so that it will work effectively. They can only build so many houses in a certain amount of time, whereas if there are speculators coming forward building houses and say, look, you can buy this off me, the speculator's happy because they make something out of it, but also the mill owner's pleased because he's got more houses that he can then rent out to those workers, and those people come and they've got homes to live in and are ready to work in those mills. So yeah,
Yeah.
quite a few people benefited from that system, but that seems to be the way that it worked.
I see. So they're offering jobs and homes at affordable rents.
Mm.
Imagining they've got great sanitation from what they're used to, and access to good food. So I know I spotted this in the archives, this advertisement in a Derby paper looking for families, particularly women and girls, to come and work in these new mills. And they mentioned that they could have homes. And some of them was even thrown in a cow.
Absolutely, yes. At Darley Abbey, certainly, there seems to be that there's, yeah, you could have a cow that would feed the family even better. Certainly, in the run up to Christmas, you tend to find that's when there's a need for more meat, so that you're eating well to get through the winter. Um, the houses in Belper and at Milford, you'd got. And at Cromford as well, you've got pigsties so that you can have a pig. The Darley Abbey one's quite interesting. It was only something that I came across quite recently that was saying that it was a cow rather than a pig. Perhaps that relates to where Darley Abbey is further down the river, so that
Mm,
it's a slightly different sort of landscape, really,
yeah.
that you're sitting. And perhaps cows were better for there than they were in the more hillier valleys further up. But yeah, pigs and cows and access to allotments as well. The Struts and the Arkwrights seem to have been some of the first to what we would see as being present day allotments, to offer those spaces, quite often called tater pieces, so potato
Oh,
pieces, but they knew them as tater pieces. And even in the rent books, they're down as it's tater, Tater, tater pieces.
wow.
Uh, so they could rent those extra pieces of land out, and that's very good. Because that means the mill workers, they're working in those mills with difficult conditions. You've got a lot of cotton dust in the air, can't be good for the lungs. To actually come home and then work in the open air in an allotment means that they're getting healthy exercise, fresh air. They're providing more food for their families, so they're
Mm,
not having to pay for food, so there's more food coming to the table. And but as well, the mill owners benefit as well, because their workers are healthier and therefore are able to work better within the mills. So again,
yeah.
everybody's a winner. I think this is a great thing, really. I mean, again, looking from today, looking back at, you think that it does sound a hard life and very restricted, but at the time, you get a sense that they could see the benefits,
Mm,
and whereas later with the industrial revolution, where you've got more and more mills, you've got people competing, and the owners are sort of, they're taking shortcuts, and it's the workers that suffer when you start to take the shortcuts. So the housing, such as in Manchester, but elsewhere in Lancashire, you've got slums developing because the housing for the mill workers was so poor, compared to what we've got here locally, and the benefits weren't there in the same way. So
mm.
the early days down in the Derwent Valley, very much they got it right, and they cared enough, and were paternalistic in ensuring that their workers did benefit, and of course they benefited because they had healthier workers.
Yeah. So let's look at the children, because we know that a lot of children worked in these mills, and I'd found my own ancestors, four children, aged between 12 and 16, going into the Darley Abbey mill to work with the cotton. So
Mm.
was there provisions made for the children that were working in these mills?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a schoolroom in the attic roof of a mill at Belper. There was a schoolroom in the attic space of a mill at Darley Abbey, and the Struts and the Evans family were related to the Struts. There'd been marriages across the families, so they certainly were working to the same sort of ideals. But uh, the structure, you've got them insisting that children had to have basic reading and writing and mathematics skills, and that meant that they were able to read instructions. Um, uh, they could write down when they needed to, if there is a certain quantity that needed to be. Uh, they've got the math skills to work out what was needed. There are all these basic skills that they could learn
Mm.
in the classroom that we take for granted now, but in those days that didn't really happen. Children at that level didn't really have schooling, and here they were ensuring that those basic basic um, sort of needs for reading, writing, and arithmetic were developed, and that they could then use those skills in the mills.
Right. And do we know if that was the same everywhere? Was that the same kind of thing, or was it
I don't.
different?
It was different. Certainly you look at the mills that were developing in the Derwent Valley, and as other mills were developing elsewhere. I mean, that two of the most notorious were Lytton and Cressbrook in the Peak District, and they were, rather than using local children, they were bringing orphans in from the big cities who were treated cruelly. They weren't given any kind of schooling. They lived on site, and they're really seen as a disposable and replaceable commodity. And you hear of so many children, certainly Lytton Churchyard, there were concerns at the amount of children's graves that were building up because of the deaths that occurred at the mills. It was very different to what was happening in those early mills that the Struts, the Evans, the Arkwrights had set up in the Derwent Valley. So
Mm.
yeah, it was a real difference to what was happening elsewhere. Um, they got it right initially. Again, this is competition, isn't it? People
Yeah.
cutting corners and seeing that if they had orphans, they could treat them as a commodity, that they could just give them the bare minimum. They didn't have to pay them in the same way. Orphans weren't paid; they were just given their board and lodgings, and that was very, very basic. And they were pushed and pushed to work very long hours, starting from a very early age. Whereas here in the Derwent Valley, you've got children. If they were working at the mill, usually they'd be working with a family member. So that family member would keep an eye on them, make sure that they didn't take risks, and so there's much less chance of serious injuries taking place
Mm.
with the machinery, because the machine was very dangerous. Really, you know, your children with the spinning mules, they've got to get under the machines to clear out dust, to oil, to any threads that snap. They've got to get them knotted together so that the machine will work again, and then they've got to get out before the whole thing just comes back along its track,
Oh.
and the space that they were in disappears, and there is a real chance of serious injury or death, and that tends not to happen, or didn't tend to happen in the mills along the Derwent Valley, mainly because the family members would ensure that they weren't in that position where they would be their lives were at risk.
Mm. It's sort of polar opposites, isn't it, really, on with some of these mills that,
Yeah,
on one hand you've got the ones in the Derwent Valley offering, homes and education, plots to grow food, working, working families together to care for one another. But then on the other hand, you've got other mills that they're working in very poor conditions, living in slums, got no space to grow, no access to outdoors, and
absolutely.
and orphans being brought in as free labor. It really is what we call now postcode lottery, but
You can understand why people we talk about the industrial revolution, and you think that they talk about satanic mills, and clearly they were, and certain in certain areas these places were horrific, and it is very different to what was the first vision of how mills would work, and the mass production of cotton and other textiles, and that the workers, admittedly not those that were as we've talked about, in the plantations where the cotton was coming from, but the workers that were actually working the machines within those mills were were treated in a much more humane way than those that followed elsewhere as industry took over people's lives and the way that the world worked, really.
Yeah. So before we move forward, we're just going to have a little creative break, and we're going to hear a poem by Abi Hutchinson, who's aged 19. And while she was at the National Justice Museum, she saw a badge saying, "To all the women that were just walking home," and that inspired this poem.
To all the women who blame themselves. Facing the Garden of Eden, you undressed, asked if you'd repeat her mistakes, as if you are not already carbon copied. Met with silence of the strangely familiar, you grimaced. Place your hands on your body of Venus, squeezed every inch that wasn't standardized by beauty, slowly removing the gaze of inner child, replacing it with damage that's internal, eternal. You cling to your own skin, try to remember what it was like before him, stand directly in front of the mirror of Eden, search for mistakes in your own image, ask Eve to repaint you before the sin of Adam. She points to the sun, lets me cook, but my skin is too dirty and cannot be cleaned with poetry. He was my apple, now it's my turn to fall. Like empires, cities, and the women before me, I'll stand back up.
What a wonderful poem, Abby, and thank you for sending it to us. So, Adrian, let's go back to the workers, and so we know that there's a huge difference depending on where you live with your living accommodation, whether there's education, food, and access to fresh air. But what about the wages? Was there differences in wages? Because I recently I went to the Museum of Making in Derby, which is within the old silk mill, and they'd got a token, a payment token. So, could you tell us a little bit about the wages of these mill workers?
Yeah, again, things depended where you were working as to how it worked. But some mill owners, if they had got goods that they wanted to sell to their workers, then paying their workers in tokens that they could only use by buying um, food generally off the mill owner, then that ensured that any money that was going out was coming straight back to them. So there were tokens out there, that didn't start with the mills really. That we know that there were nail makers in Belper, and there used to in Belper, a big town now, but at one stage it only had the one shop. The shop was owned by a Mr. Jackson. He was a nail master, and he would use tokens to pay his nail workers so that they then used those tokens in his shop. So that
Gosh.
was before the struts and the cotton mills arrived in the town. So it not really a new thing for the mills, but certainly something that was used um, more widely as the Industrial Revolution moved forwards. Uh,
Mm,
can't see any record of that. It may have happened, but I haven't seen anything in terms of the Derwent Valley mills as we the cotton mills as we go up the Derwent Valley. One of the things that someone did show me a few years ago was the way the mill workers, obviously their wages were in coins, because it wasn't a huge wage by any means to what we would recognize as a wage, but each mill worker had a tiny bucket which was only about an inch across, and that was with a little handle and a number on it, and everyone knew their number and would look for their bucket and their tiny little bucket with a series of coins in that little bucket. That was how they would be paid.
oh, yeah.
So you looked for your bucket, you emptied your bucket, and then you handed your bucket back, and that would be refilled for the following week, which I think is rather lovely. Would it have been a table full of little buckets? I'm not sure how they
Yeah.
would have paid them, but it's quite interesting how that developed as a way of paying. But saying that as well, that we've said that other mill workers, mill owners would have goods that they wanted to sell to the mill workers, and certainly the Struts were the same. They had their own farms. They were producing produce that could then be brought into the town and sold to the mill workers, and I think that a way of taking that out of wages before the wages were even paid. So
Mm.
that was another way of doing it, which didn't involve a sort of token scheme.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, isn't it? Really, I suppose that an equivalent today would be going to work for a major supermarket and your wages in supermarket tokens and vouchers. You can't
Yes, yes,
spend them anywhere else other than
no,
back in that same place. So,
yeah,
how are they expected to sort of be able to better themselves or to be able to save or to, buy their own property or, move, if they're dependent on, well,
yes,
they become dependent, don't they? I think that's probably the
yes,
point.
it reduces your choices and it keeps you, if not loyal, then certainly anchored to the owner of the business that you work for.
Gosh,
Mm.
yeah. So as time went on and we're moving sort of into the sort of early to mid 1800s, the Industrial Revolution's really ramping up, and there's that more need for more profit. Was there any other examples of all these? We've heard about Strutt and Arkwrights and Evans doing, very good things for their workers, providing homes with sanitation and education and good food.
Mm.
Does that stay true throughout into this period, or do things change as the need for more profit arises?
I think that there's not the same pressure. I think the reason why in the Derwent Valley it's so unusual, we've got early mill buildings, we've got um, uh, the communities, you can still recognise them. Whereas in later communities where there were a lot of mills and there was a lot of competition, mills are being pulled down and rebuilt bigger, and houses are going up quickly and aren't of a particularly good standard, so they don't last so long. And then so there are a lot of changes where there's been survival from an early stage in the valley, and I think that really is because of the quality of what was done in those early stages. You do get there are things that are incorporated into how the mills work, which shows signs that they're still thinking about those workers. You've got William Strutt, great innovator. He produced with a friend Charles Bage. They were looking at fireproof buildings, which effectively were the world's first skyscrapers. William also developed a round mill, and with that round mill, it had vents in the top, which were sort of octagonal in shape, but they drew the air out of the mill, which allowed fresh air to come in. And of course, the air in these mills would become full of cotton fibers. The cotton
Mm,
is the fibers are so fine that as you start to rip apart the tightly packaged um, cotton bales, then you start to see that cotton dust floating about, and that gets into people's lungs. And one of the biggest problems for cotton mill workers over the centuries has been getting those cotton fibers into the lungs, and then gradually reducing your ability to breathe,
mm,
so that you were not able to work. And so that was his attempt to encourage the air to circulate more quickly, so that there would be fresh air, so that wouldn't cause so many problems.
right.
Unfortunately, he used the same system when he built the first Derbyshire infirmary in Derby, And of course, the only problem with more air circulation is that if anyone had got anything contagious, that actually rattled around the building more quickly as well. So
Oh,
whereas it was a great benefit to the mill, it was not a great benefit for the
mm,
infirmary. So it's interesting, isn't it? These ways of trying to come up with ways of improving people's uh, fresh air, so that they were able to work better. But it doesn't always work. Depends on the
yeah.
circumstances.
Gosh, well, that's really interesting to hear about that invention because I know when I've been looking at the four siblings of my own ancestors, two out of those four did die of cotton lung in the early adulthood. So I think it was
Mm.
a very common killer. But I think it's having a bit of a resurgence as well in other areas of the world with the costs of fast fashion with people working in poor conditions. So it's
Mm.
interesting seeing this sort of delving into history, but it's still happening today in other places of the world, isn't it?
It is, yeah, yeah, and it's a shame, really, that to think that having learned what the problem was so long ago, that still these things are allowed to happen. But as you say, it's pressure of trying to produce large quantities of goods
Mm,
at a very low rate. It's the people that are working in those circumstances that suffer for that.
yeah. Well, thank you, Adrian, for sort of helping us dive into the lives of the mill workers. And if people are visiting the Derwent Valley, what is there still left standing of these either mills or mill workers' homes that people could go and have a look at?
There's a lot, really. Certainly, Darley Abbey, Milford, Belper, and Cromford are all mill workers' communities where you can still see the cottages where they lived. They're still in use. You can see quite a few of those pigsties at Cromford and in Belper. Some of the allotments have survived particularly well in Cromford. Less of them have survived in Belper or Milford or Darley Abbey. But the chapels that were provided, there's schools, even swimming baths, although they've gone now as well. The buildings are still stand; they've been reused. That you can still get a real sense of how the community worked, and how good those houses were that the workers received. Even back in the 18th century, a lot of the houses were being built from 1771 onwards, and they're of a really good quality,
Mm,
and they're still with us and still worth looking at today.
wow. Oh, thank you so much, Adrian. It just makes you think when you go and visit in these places, about those lives of people that once was there. And definitely with my own ancestry, one of my great great grandmother was actually born in a mill worker's cottage in Darley Abbey, and it still stands today. So I'd love to be able to go in and have a peek around at where she was born, but somebody lives in there.
You never. It's sometimes worth knocking on the door. You never know.
Yes. Well, thank you once again, Adrian, for being such a fantastic guest and really helping us paint a picture of the differences of mill workers' lives and that real lottery of where you lived and the conditions that you were faced with. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Over the coming months, the project will be developing, and there's lots of ways that you can get in touch and find out more. Just head to my website and click on the project page, Standing in This Place.